Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Origins of Tolkien's Middle-earth for Dummies by Greg Harvey. Narrated by Eric Jason Martin. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Limit of liability, disclaimer of warranty. While the publisher and author have used their best efforts in preparing this book, they make no representations or warranties with respect to the accuracy or completeness of the contents of this book, and specifically disclaim any implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. No warranty may be created or extended by sales representatives or written sales materials. The advice and strategies contained herein may not be suitable for your situation. You should consult with a professional where appropriate. Neither the publisher nor author shall be liable for any loss of profit or any other commercial damages, including but not limited to special, incidental, consequential, or other damages. Foreword by Professor Alfred Sievers, Bucknell University. J.R.R. Tolkien's writing and drinking buddy C.S. Lewis wrote that reading Edmund Spenser's poem The Faerie Queene, the granddaddy of English-language fantasy lit, was therapeutic for the body as well as the mind. I'll say the same thing here today about Tolkien's own Lord of the Rings, for similar reasons, and forgetting about the movies for now. My first encounter with Tolkien's work was my older sister's dog-eared 1960s paperback version of the trilogy, which I read under the covers with a flashlight as a teenager, and read again and again. During those years of late-night reading, that same sister was in the next room, suffering from a chronic illness that too soon turned fatal. Tolkien has helped a lot of us, at different times and in different ways, get through the night. Indeed, I could have had much worse traveling companions growing up. His writing put me in touch with mythic and medieval traditions that helped inform whatever positive patterns of work and faith I rely on today, with a sense of the mystery and value of life. If this sounds like a testimonial, it is. Tolkien's fantasy is often taken as entertaining escapism, and it is, in part, involving as it does the unexpected joy of the fairy tales he loved. But in this book, Greg Harvey admirably discusses the therapeutic aspect of fantasy, while also explaining with helpful clarity and humor the underpinnings of Tolkien's Middle-earth. He delivers the big picture that still escapes those of us who grew up reading just The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and not the posthumously published and edited Silmarillion and the multi-volumed History of Middle-earth. Harvey does this in part by suggesting unexpected parallels between the unusually interactive effect on readers of Tolkien's project, writing a Catholic epic as English mythology, and experiential spiritual traditions, including Harvey's own Zen Buddhist practice. It's no coincidence that fantasy literature emerged, as Tolkienologist Tom Shippey observed, as a primary genre of the 20th century. When students in my medieval literature classes slam the Middle Ages as violent and superstitious, I come right back at them with the 20th century. Its atrocities far surpass those of the pre-modern and traditional cultures we often deride, even when trying to be polite. The horrors of the Holocaust and the persecution of Christians in the Soviet Union are just two prime examples, but fantasy is not merely an escape from such horrors. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio has recently and brilliantly illuminated the obvious points that emotion and reason are related, and that literature serves a cognitive purpose in developing and stimulating emotion. Herein lies part of the case for fantasy literature. It can help treat the modern bipolarity of heart and mind that enables our hyper-cruelties through a contemplative reading that reconnects intellect and emotion. And key to Tolkien's successful fantasy therapy is that he moored it in tradition. In our global consumer society, it is usually considered a good thing to oppose and overturn tradition, or to colonize it smorgasbord style, picking and choosing from cultures around the world or from the past that with which we like to adorn ourselves. Tolkien did a good bit of such shopping around himself for the sake of his fantasy storytelling. And yet he did so in 3 ways that set his work apart. First, as a man who was personally embedded in traditional Catholicism. Second, as a scholar who was deeply respectful of early medieval literatures of Europe that emerged in an earlier Christianity engaged with ancient storytelling and myth. And finally, as a thoughtful 20th century writer who personally had experienced some of the worst warfare in history and saw himself profoundly outside modern life and government. There is an anti-modernist aspect to tradition, an almost organic wisdom tested over centuries of human interaction in family and community situations, a source of resistance to globalization that need not be exclusionary. Thus, various communitarian traditional cultures, whether they be early Christian, Taoist, Buddhist, Native American, or something else, tend to resist modern Western ideologies and assumptions that seek to turn human beings into abstractions or commodities. Tolkien tapped into this sense of tradition in part through his own religious background. He grew up an orphan in turn-of-the-century industrial Birmingham among a community of Catholic priests founded by the great Victorian retro-medievalist Cardinal John Henry Newman. With perhaps dim memories in mind of the lush gardens of South Africa, where he was born in 1892, Tolkien also delighted in childhood trips to the green countryside of the West Midlands on the border of Wales, in the old Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, which he mythically identified as the land of his ancestors. Later, it became the basis for the Shire. In the process, his encounters with Welsh helped inspire his lifelong fascination with words as mythic icons, and also with an earlier Christian tradition. Tolkien said once in a lecture that The Lord of the Rings contains, in the way of presentation that I find most natural, much of what I personally have received from the study of things Celtic. In The Lord of the Rings, the names of persons and places in this story were mainly composed on patterns deliberately modeled on those of Welsh. This element in the tale has given perhaps more pleasure to more readers than anything else in it. He would also fondly refer in his famous essay on Beowulf to less severe Celtic learning, in contrast with his main field of study in early English literature. Here we get to the heart, I think, of why Tolkien's fantasy appeals so broadly to audiences today, ranging from conservative Christians to neo-pagan eco-activists. In connecting with early Celtic fairy lore of the otherworld, as found in early medieval Irish and Welsh stories, Tolkien was also connecting with a method of storytelling that was formed, as the Celticist John Carey indicates, in a non-Augustinian Christian view of nature. Forgive me for slipping on my Don's dunce cap to lecture for a moment, but this too is, I think, important to our story. At the time of the fall of Rome, Augustine of Hippo, with his many virtues, set the agenda for a Western view emphasizing nature as distanced from God and corrupt, in which salvation was achieved through grace and not nature, and God's signs in nature were arbitrary objects. By contrast, religious traditions in Wales and Ireland had maintained more of a connection with the emphases of Greek writers and desert ascetics who developed throughout the Middle Ages a sense of how uncreated divine energies flowed through nature. For them, salvation worked iconographically through a synergy of grace and choice, of faith and nature. The views of Augustine's critic John Cashin regarding nature were closer to those of the white and green martyrs of Irish monasticism. So the early Irish and Welsh otherworld stories that were ultimately the basis for Tolkien's elves, central figures in his Silmarillion and important to The Lord of the Rings, drew on pagan Celtic themes in the context of that older Christianity whose emphases lingered longer in Wales and Ireland than elsewhere in the West, as suggested, for example, by recent historical writings of K.P. Dark on cultural continuity in early medieval Britain. The immortals of Celtic stories, who ultimately became Tolkien's elves, were examples of unfallen human beings, of what we could become through the process of deification opened to us in this Christian view through the incarnation of Christ. Nature itself, while mired in mortality by the fall, in Augustinian overtones, was still in part an icon of the incarnate God, still with aspects of the original creation, be they Ents or Tom Bombadil. This was the crossroad of faith and myth, of the spiritual and the natural, where Tolkien worked out his fantasy epic and its backstory. There he found his iconographic symbols of integration in words and their histories, real and imagined. In his skillful hands, and despite his own peculiar limitations, words could become, at times, something more than modern metaphor or ideology, a mythic naming, metonymy, suggesting the union of mind and heart sought after in many traditions, a grounding of imagination in life, a paralleling in secular story, perhaps, of the spiritual function of visual icons in the Greek Christian world. Tolkien accomplished all this as someone who had experienced, as a young combatant at the Battle of the Somme during World War I, some of the worst horror of the modern world, and who remained throughout his life something of an outsider in his own beloved Midlands. As a South African native with a German surname, raised a Catholic orphan in a still harshly Protestant and insular England, he was no fan of the British Empire, and severely criticized later the apartheid of his native land, as well as Nazi anti-Semitism. Yet he remained an advocate of what he called unconstitutional monarchy with anarchistic elements. He was a believer in traditional authority who was nonetheless intensely suspicious of modern states and of trends that today we call globalization. Most serious writing on Tolkien's fantasy has been by scholars with backgrounds in European medieval studies similar to Tolkien's own, notably Jane Chance and Tom Shippey. Greg Harvey's book was not written to be scholarship, but to be a helpful commentary for us readers. It does that job most worthily, and while I may not always agree with all of his connections and interpretations, it is well informed by knowledge and especially experience. The For Dummies title refers to the humility required in approaching Tolkien's complex myth, not to the level of insight herein. The parallels Harvey shows between Tolkien's fantasy and Buddhism, for example, point up the archetypal nature of Tolkien's work and the value of traditional approaches to life already mentioned. This work will have a valued place on my shelf of Tolkien books, and I hope it will on yours as well. Introduction. This book is the result of serendipity, a happy accident. One day in 2002, as I was returning from a business trip to my publisher, Wiley, in Indianapolis, I happened to turn to an in-flight channel that was playing the National Geographic program Beyond the Movie, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. In this film, a couple of scenes concern the relationship of Tolkien's Elvish language to Finnish, and, moreover, the relationship of some themes in The Lord of the Rings to the Finnish epic poem the Kalevala. What was so extraordinary about this was that I had just finished reading The Key to the Kalevala by Pekka Ervast, a theosophical analysis of the poem's major themes, as part of my studies in Western philosophy and religion. Up to that time, I had been aware only of Tolkien's scholarly study of the Old English epic poem Beowulf, another text I had been studying, and that it had influenced his Middle-earth mythology. This tie-in with the Kalevala sent me off on a new round of research and study, comparing my understanding of Tolkien's Middle-earth with my knowledge of language, mythology, philosophy, and religion. This book is the result of that endeavor. As a student of comparative philosophy and religion, and not comparative literature, I want to make clear my approach to this material. In place of standard literary analysis, which often emphasizes the author and his or her relationship with the material, I employ hermeneutics, a fancy word that means analyzing a text, usually a religious one like the Bible, and figuring out its possible meanings solely from the text itself. Therefore, in this book I'm much more likely to be looking for the internal meaning in Tolkien's books, the Silmarillion, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings specifically, than for what Tolkien said about the meaning of his own works, although that's important too. Adopting this as the primary approach enables me to analyze the possible origins of Middle-earth, or at least connections between it and other traditional mythologies and religions, without worrying exclusively about whether Tolkien himself was aware of these traditions or possible connections. Hermeneutics holds that the work stands apart from its author in such a way that it can be subjected to interpretations that the author neither deliberately intended nor was conscious of. If the work, taken as a whole, suggests a particular interpretation to an audience, then that interpretation is valid, even if the author would not necessarily agree with it. Interestingly enough, Tolkien took a somewhat similar position in urging scholars to employ an organic rather than piecemeal interpretation of Beowulf. As mythology, Middle-earth and its lore are as real for me as the mythologies of the Greeks, Romans, Celts, Vikings, Germanic tribes, and Finnish peoples from whom Tolkien so heavily borrowed. I therefore analyze Tolkien's tales with the same eye for meaning that I employ when exploring the meaning of the Kalevala, or a Taoist philosophical text. It's a testament to the tremendous talent and love that Tolkien poured into his work that it is so full of deep meaning, stands so well in comparison to other mythologies, and is so relevant to our lives. About this book. This book is a basic guide to some of the possible linguistic and mythological origins of Tolkien's Middle-earth. It provides a rudimentary analysis of its many themes and lessons for our world. It is not, I repeat, not an encyclopedia or quick guide to the diverse beings, languages, and history that make up Tolkien's Middle-earth. It is also not a set of outlines or notes of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. If your intention in buying this book is to be able to converse intelligently with your friends or pass a literature course about Middle-earth without actually bothering to read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, you had best put this book back on the shelf right now. If there's a higher purpose to this book, it is simply to entice you and prepare you to get more enjoyment from reading or rereading The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and possibly even the Silmarillion. This book is intended to enrich your understanding of Tolkien's books on Middle-earth, but it is in no way a replacement for them. It's especially targeted at you Lord of the Rings moviegoers who intend to delve into the books. The basic method I employ to enhance your reading experience of Tolkien is to look at his world's basic components, geography, beings, history, and underlying themes, through the richness of their language and myth. Often, examining the language and myth exposes a little of the hidden structure of Tolkien's Middle-earth, and provides a basis on which its meanings may be discussed and understood. My final purpose in writing this book is to challenge you to think about the themes inherent in Tolkien's stories about Middle-earth and their implications in your own life. I don't really care whether you agree with any particular analysis I make. I will have reached my goal if I simply get you to start thinking about what you think and how you feel about it. Foolish assumptions. I have a few assumptions I make about you as a reader, and I urge you to check them out before you check this book out at the cash register. You've read The Lord of the Rings at least once, even if it was 20 years ago, or have seen Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies. The basic storyline of the quest to destroy the One Ring of Power touched you at some level, even if you're not sure why. You're intrigued by the characters, cultures, and languages of Middle-earth, even though they confuse you and border on being overwhelming. You're curious about where this fantasy world came from, and why it's so complex and intense, even if you're not sure that you really want to get involved with its detail. If my first assumption fits, and you can agree with at least one of the other ones, then I think that you've come to the right book. If, on the other hand, you don't fit the profile outlined in the first point, and are understandably hesitant to agree with any of the others, then you might want to hold off on this purchase, at least until you've seen the film version of The Lord of the Rings. How to use this book. Tolkien's writings rely heavily on new vocabulary, and much of that comes from languages he invented for Middle-earth. Keeping these names straight can be overwhelming to all but the most avid Middle-earth lore masters. I encourage you to make liberal use of this book's index when you come up against an odd name and you're just not sure who or what it is. Still, I do expect that many of you may feel snowed under by the sheer weight of unfamiliar terms bandied about in the book. For this, I apologize ahead of time. It seems to be the nature of Tolkien's beast to inundate the reader in complex storylines muddied by tons of elvish names that are almost impossible to keep straight. I know that in my earlier days with the Silmarillion, I was fully convinced that I'd never be able to remember the difference between the kingdom of Gondolin and Doriath, let alone keep Fingolfin straight from Finarfin, or tell the Teleri elves from the Noldor. In time, though, I gained the ability to realize the larger backstory without being overwhelmed by the particular names and places involved. Slowly but surely, I was able to plug in these details. I advise you to adopt a similar strategy in dealing with this book's material. As much as possible, don't worry about keeping the character names and place names straight. Just accept that you won't immediately understand all the references, and may not be able to keep them straight even after looking them up in the index. Instead, try to keep your focus on the larger point I'm making about the characters and places. In time, you may be surprised to find that you're beginning to understand who and what and where and, more importantly, how they all fit together into the tapestry of Middle-earth. And when that day comes, if you're like me, you'll be amazed at the intricacy of Tolkien's weaving. How this book is organized. This book is divided into 6 parts, so you get to enjoy 6 rich Tennant cartoons. Each part addresses a different major component of Tolkien's Middle-earth, from its geography to the major themes and myths it teaches. 2 components, the beings and themes of Middle-earth in parts 2 and 5, respectively, are more complicated than the rest, and so contain multiple chapters that you can visit in any order. 3 others are 2-chapter affairs in which the first chapter gives a more general overview and the second goes into a little more detail. The last part offers 3 handy top 10 lists. Part 1. The Geography of Middle-earth. This part tries to make you feel at home in Middle-earth by introducing you to its geography. Chapter 1 gives you a general orientation to Tolkien's Middle-earth, including its possible linguistic origin and its existence as a world of fantasy, mythology, history, and language. Chapter 2 looks at specific lands of Middle-earth that feature prominently in Tolkien's tales. Part 2. The Beings of Middle-earth. The 8 chapters in this part acquaint you with the many different types of beings that populate the lands of Middle-earth, only some of whom are human, pairing them up with the lands they inhabit and pointing out their place in Tolkien tales. Part 3. The History of Middle-earth. This part gives an outline of the enormous history of Middle-earth. Chapter 11 covers the earlier ages, which appropriately are more like legend and mythology in nature than historical fact. Chapter 12 covers the three major historical ages that Tolkien imagined for his world. Part 4. The Languages of Middle-earth. This part deals with the role of language in Middle-earth. Chapter 13 investigates Tolkien's general use of language and how his ideas on its importance and power compare with traditional ideas held by ancient peoples. Chapter 14 examines the characteristics of the actual languages that Tolkien invented for the various races of Middle-earth. Part 5. The Themes and Mythology of Middle-earth. This part forms the core of the book. These 9 chapters explore the major themes and mythologies embodied in Tolkien's stories about Middle-earth. The topics here are diverse as the stories themselves: good and evil, death and immortality, true love, heroism, fate and free will, the ring and its relation to other ring myths, environmental concerns, and gender and sex. Part 6. The Part of Tens. This last part gives you a few at-a-glance chapters filled with facts for easy ingestion. Chapter 24 gives a blow-by-blow account of the top 10 battles in the War of the Ring, chronicled in The Lord of the Rings. Chapter 25 is a list of my top 10 websites for learning more about Tolkien's Middle-earth. Chapter 26 gives you my top 10 differences between Tolkien's book and Peter Jackson's movie versions of The Lord of the Rings. Icons used in this book. Icons warn of information of very narrow or specific interest. Most of them occur in front of the sidebars that are strewn throughout the text. They quickly identify the following types of extraneous information. Remember indicates some sort of idea, character, symbol, or meaning that recurs in Tolkien's Middle-earth. Trivia denotes obscure or strange facts about origins or connections that may or may not be of interest, depending on how deep you're into this stuff. Vocabulary points out heavy-duty language associations that I'm trying to make. Stay clear if language isn't your thing. Technical stuff signals a place where there is a lot of specific detail or history. When you're dealing with Tolkien, who revels in cross-associations and fine points, it can be a bit much for all except hardcore Tolkien enthusiasts. Where to go from here? The immediate answer to this question is simple. Before you do anything else, check out the cartoons at the beginning of the 6 parts of the book. After that, it depends on what you want to know. Unlike Tolkien's books, this one isn't meant to be read from cover to cover. You can pick and choose according to what you're keen to know about Middle-earth. If you tend not to skip around, I hope you find the progression of topics a natural one that gets you primed and ready to explore the major themes and mythologies. Enjoy. Part 1. The Geography of Middle-earth. In this part, where exactly is Tolkien's Middle-earth, and what kind of world is it anyway? Part 1 provides answers to these questions by giving you a general introduction to the many realms and lands that Middle-earth encompasses, and in so doing, orients you to the rest of the book. This part investigates the relationship between the world of Middle-earth and our world, while giving you an overview of the wide and varied landscape that this world entails. Chapter 1. The Worlds of Middle-earth. In this chapter, the location and origin of Middle-earth, Tolkien's idea of fantasy, the underlying mythology of Middle-earth, Tolkien's strange and wonderful beings, the historical framework of Middle-earth, Middle-earth's diverse languages. In its broadest sense, geography is the study of the physical features of the world, as well as its biological and cultural characteristics. When attempting to deal with the geography of a fantasy world like Middle-earth, as envisioned by J.R.R. Tolkien, you're almost compelled to use this wider definition, even if your only goal is to get an overview of its many features. For Tolkien's Middle-earth is never just one of physical geography filled with strange lands, weird...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?